Hello, this is going to be a quick screencast trying to show how you can use the debugger in Google Chrome web browser specifically to test JavaScript. And what I'm going to look at is the work that you've done in the workshop on page 3 of my website that's sort of going to implement this. So I'm going to use this code as a demonstration, and I'll put the URL for this just in case there's anyone out there in video land who's interested in this set of tutorials. So what this code is going to do, we've got some HTML that will create some articles. We'll create an onload listener which will grab those articles using query selector all. It'll loop through them and it will add an on mouse enter that will add a border on the left hand side. So I've actually already set that up, and when I mouse over, sure enough, we get a border on the left hand side using mouse enter and mouse leave. So let's have a look at how we might use the debugger to figure out what that's doing and to watch our code. I can't stress enough, there are different sorts of errors that will happen when you're using JavaScript. One is syntax errors, and they're relatively easy to solve because the debugger will tell us that there's an error on what line it is. But there's frequently more subtle logic errors where you've just made a mistake in the code in some way. Maybe in an if statement you've got the wrong condition, and so the code inside that if statement, because it's the wrong condition, never gets executed, and the debugger will help with that. The other kind of thing that the debugger will help with is it'll allow you to explore the DOM to find the names of properties that you know you want to alter, but you don't know exactly how to reference them and what they're called. So to open the debugger, I'm just going to right mouse click and choose inspect. There are some hotkeys to do that, but I can never remember what they are, so right mouse click. Now the important tabs here are elements, console, sources, and in some cases network is particularly important as well. The others are important, but they're beyond the scope of this. Elements, it will allow us to actually look at the DOM, and we can highlight things, and it's particularly useful because you can play around with styles and change things. For instance, I'm unticking border there, and if you look on the screen the border disappears, so that can be quite useful, but usually when you're playing around with CSS. But insofar as JavaScript, we're also going to alter the DOM, perhaps, adding data set properties or altering styles. If you make any such changes, they will appear here in the DOM, and so you can examine them by looking at the Elements tab. Console is particularly useful because that will show me some errors. Okay, so any errors that appear will show up there. It's also useful because you can actually type in JavaScript code. So for instance, that Google Chrome Dev Tools is heading 1, so I could go document query selector. I could get hold of that H1 using a CSS selector, and I could change its style.color, spelled in the American way, to equal red, for instance. And on the screen it's changed to red. I've actually altered that thing in the DOM, and I can execute all sorts of commands here. I can set up loops and run through them. There's no limit really to what you can do in terms of executing code here. It's very, very useful. And the Sources tab is particularly useful because, and by the way, when it opens up, that can sometimes be blank, in which case you just click on the file you want here and it will open. One other thing, in the labs, this console, this window that I'm seeing here, appears on the right hand side of the screen, and I don't like it there. So if you click on this small, well, I suppose it's a hamburger menu, but it's so tiny, let's call it a kebab menu, you can alter where it docks, and often it's docked on the right hand side there in the labs, but I much prefer it. That's the university labs. I much prefer it underneath. And just occasionally you'll see an even smaller window here, which is this console tab that's opened. And again, I don't know why it does that, and I don't quite know how to stop it doing that. But if that does happen, you'll see a little X here, and you can just close it down since it's just taking up screen space, and you've got the console tab here if you want it. Now, the important thing about this source is that we can see the code, but we can set breakpoints and see the code run. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to click in the margin, it just highlights that, and that is now a breakpoint. So when the code runs, it will come to that line and it will stop execution. So let's do that. I've attached a window event listener. On the load event, it will run this function. And I've actually given it a name rather than make it an anonymous function, just because it shows up slightly better in the debugger here, or rather this part of the debugger. It will show up in the call stack with the name of the function that's been executed. Okay, so let's reload the page. So in it comes. We've got this variable called articles, look, currently undefined. It also shows up here under this tab local. Shows up as local because it's inside this function. If there weren't a function here and there was just some code, it wouldn't show up in local, it would show up in global. And global is a very large list, long list, of all of the things that are in global scope. So that can sometimes be a bit problematic. If you put something in global scope, first of all, it's a bad thing, but it also makes it a bit difficult for you to find the variable if it's there in global scope, in which case you can click on watch and make it show you something. Actually, I've got some watches there left over from something else. So let's get rid of those. Actually, let's use an example. I'm going to set up a variable current article, so I'll add a watch for that. So I just clicked on the plus, typed in current article, and now it's just a kind of easy way to keep a quick track of that. Obviously pointless in this case because it's perfectly visible there, but if it were a global variable, it's a handy place to put a variable to keep an eye on what it's doing. Okay, so article is currently undefined because that line of code is not executed yet. These buttons here control the execution. That one just makes the script run. This one will step over a function call. So in other words, if I've got some code here that called a function, that code would run that code, but it wouldn't go into the function to watch it. That, on the other hand, will go into a function so we can see it executing. This one you'll probably use less, but what that will do is if you've gone into a function and you want to jump back out again, then that will just jump you back out to where you came from in the first place. Okay, so we'll step forward one step, and sure enough, articles now equals an array of two things. I say array, in actual fact, it's, strictly speaking, it's not an array. Query selector all returns a node list, as it showed up there, a node list of two things. But it looks a bit like an array, and it behaves like an array in lots of ways. We can loop through it in exactly the same way. So now I'm going to set up another variable called the number of articles, which is just the article's length. So in other words, that'll equal 2. Step forward, and number of articles equals 2. Obviously that's a good idea to store it into a variable, because each time around this loop I can refer to that variable instead of putting articles.length, which would in a way make it recalculate that. Now in actual fact, there's the eagle-eyed amongst you might have already spotted that I've made a logic mistake in my code there, but we don't know that yet. Using the debugger, we don't know that yet. So here I am for n equals 0, so n is currently undefined. Step forward one step, it looks at the condition, and it goes forward, and n equals 0. So what I'm doing is I'm looking at articles n, and I'm pulling it into a variable. I frequently do that because I find it easier to refer to a variable rather than articles n, which I could have done. I'll stop moving my mouse around because otherwise those windows pop up. But actually those windows popping up is quite useful because you can mouse over that and this is the article, and this can actually sometimes be really useful. Look, I can look at the current article and see all of these properties that I could alter about it. Yeah, I mean that's sometimes a really useful thing to be able to do. It's what I used in order to find out how to alter things. Oh no, there's something called inner HTML that I could alter, or there's something called last child, and what's that equal? And you know, I use the debugger sometimes to explore, to find out more about the things that I might want to do. So I've pulled out a particular article, and now I'm assigning a mouse enter event to it to equal this anonymous function. So when the mouse enter event fires, it will jump into this code here. So actually, out of interest, I'm going to put a breakpoint there so that when I do mouse enter, I can see what this code is going to do. So I click in the margin, and what's going to happen now when I click next, it will jump from that line to this line. Sorry, move my mouse out of the way. It'll jump from this line, which we're on at the moment, to line 42, because what line 37 does is it's just assigning a listener to mouse enter in a way that line there finishes here, hence the semicolon, because it's just an assignment. I'm just saying mouse enter equals this function, just like you might say, well, here, number of articles equals something, and at the end of the line you put a semicolon. So it's going to jump to line 42. It does. By the way, that's the other way I use the debugger. I don't just click and watch it, I try and predict what it will do, because that way if it doesn't do what I predict, I've obviously misunderstood or I've made a mistake, and either way that's useful to know. So now it's going to go back to that top of that for loop. It's going to increment n, so n is currently 0 here, but the n++ there will add 1 to it, so n is now 1, goes into the loop, and it fetches out article 1 into current article, and it adds a mouse event listener to that, and then a mouse leave listener to that, and it comes on around, it increments 1 to be 2, and now it gets article number 2, and it adds a mouse event listener to that. Aha, an error, something's happened. Now what happened? Let's go to the console, which is where errors appear. In actual fact, there's done slightly more errors than are particular to us. Some of these errors are actually to do with add-ons that I've got in my browser, and they're not to do with this particular page. So actually, I'm going to get rid of all of those errors, reload the page, and you'll see. And again, I'm inside one of the add-ons. Let's do that again. In we come. We're getting a list of the articles. Let me just go and get rid of any errors that appeared. None yet. It loops through, it gets that one, it adds a mouse listener, adds a mouse leave, gets the next one, adds a mouse enter, adds a mouse leave, gets the next one, adds a mouse enter, adds a mouse leave, and it throws an error, and the error is cannot set property on mouse enter of undefined. So here I am trying to set mouse enter, and current article is undefined. Didn't spot that. So what might I have done wrong? Let's run it again. Just click reload. Just let that run. Sorry about this. It's loading lots of things from my add-ons, which aren't the stuff we're interested in. Okay, so it seems to be going wrong about this line here, so I'm going to put a breakpoint there instead, and I'll click run. So current article, what does it equal? Undefined. Okay, now we grab current article, and current article equals that article, the one that's in blue on the screen above. I'm going to click run, and it will go round the loop and come to another one, and current article is now the next article. So I'm on the last one, so let's let it run around. Oh, and I'm getting another one, and let it step forward one line of code, and that current article, look, is undefined. So that's why I'm getting an error, because I'm about to try and attach an on-mouse enter event to something that's undefined. Well, why is that? Well, n, look, is 2, and I've only got 2 articles, and articles, if you remember, in an array, there's article 0 and article 1, which is why I've got 2 of them, but I'm about to access with article n equaling 2. In other words, it would be as though there's a third article. So my counter is incremented 1 too many. Now, the reason for that, let me switch to my code editor. The reason for that is because of this operator here. Instead of saying whilst n is less than the number of articles, because there are 2 articles and they're numbered 0 to 1, I've said less than or equal to the number of articles, which means that my n has incremented to 2, and that means I'm referencing some third article that doesn't exist. So that's the cause of my error. And you might not have spotted that because the code ran perfectly well. It was just that when it hit that line of code there, suddenly I get an error. Cannot set property on mouse enter of undefined. So let's remove that equals, save the code, and run it again. So reload, stop it from looking at that, click on the debugger, in it comes, gets all the articles, works out how many there are, loops through them, picks up article 0 and stores that into current article, picks up article 1 and stores that into current article. But now when it checks that loop condition, n is 1, which means it's the end of that particular loop, and it will jump to the bottom and finish. Okay, so let's take off these breakpoints by clicking in the second time in the margin, and I've left the breakpoint there so that when we do on mouse enter, it will we can see what happens. Okay, because in fact something wasn't happening. If you notice my code here, I've set the border left to be red, and if you remember right at the start, that actually worked, but the font weight didn't go to bold. So what's happening there? What's gone wrong? So I'm going to mouse over there. It pops onto this breakpoint because I've just triggered that event called on mouse enter. So I'm inside this code, which is this function from on mouse enter, and it's about to set the border left to equal that. Now it's quite useful because you can mouse over these things and see what the style property is. Or here you can click on this, which is inside a listener. This refers to the element which actually caused the event to trigger. Okay. So inside this we can see all of the properties of this, i.e. the current article that we're on. And we're interested in the style property. By the way, we can also see all of the listeners that are currently attached to it. And notice that on mouse enter and on mouse leave have got functions attached to them, whereas all of these others are null. They've got functions attached to them because that's what my code did. Anyway, let's not get too sidetracked. Let's go down to style and let's look at all the properties. Well, I'm altering border left, so let's find what border is at the bottom. Well, border is a blank, and border left is a blank. So when we do that line of code, let's do it, we'll suddenly find that, I have to go back down again, we'll suddenly find that border left now equals that, whereas previously it just equaled a blank. So now I'm about to alter font weight, and font weight's not working. Well, why? So let's go down and have a look at font weight. Where is it? Font weight is a blank. So let's run that line of code, and the font up here, look, hasn't gone to bold. So what's gone wrong? Once again, sorry, let's go back down to here to font weight and see what's happened. Look, font weight is still blank, but I've created something called font weight, which is bold. In other words, look, I got the capitalization wrong, because you perhaps know that any CSS attribute that normally features a hyphen, because if we were writing this in CSS, we put font hyphen weight. Well, because a hyphen is actually a minus sign in JavaScript, then we can't have font minus weight, so we take away the hyphen and we capitalize the following letter, so it's font weight. So I've assigned to something called font weight, and so it's just happily created that new property, but that new property actually is a fictitious one, it doesn't really exist. So that has enabled me to spot a quite subtle error for something not working. If I change that to capital, save it, reload my page, I'll take off the breakpoints, just reload the page, and the page runs, we'll now find that when I hover over something, the font weight goes back. If except it doesn't disappear again. So what have I forgotten to do? Well, I made the same mistake here, unsetting it. I needed to set font weight back to being a blank again. So again, save the page, reload it, and now it behaves exactly as I wanted it to. So hopefully you've got some idea of how useful the debugger can be. You can watch code run, and I've found personally that's really helpful in just understanding how code works in general, but it's also really useful for tracking down errors, looking at variables, trying out code here, seeing if anything's changed here. Actually, just while I'm quickly on, let's do something that's kind of pointless, but let's do it anyway. Let's go document, query selector, I'm going to get that H1 as I did before, but what I'm going to do is set its dataset property dot oh, I can't, suddenly gone blank. Nothing. There's no such thing, because I'm just making it up. It's just as a demo equals a test. Actually, I should have set a property called test to equal demo. That sounds more pointless. So having introduced that in my code, I'm going to save that, come back here, go to sources. I'll set a breakpoint here, because when I reload the page, that code will suddenly appear underneath. Okay, so take off the breakpoint. I'm interested in this line of code, so I'm going to step forward until that line of code runs. Let me go to elements and open up H1. Here's that H1 element loop. And now let's execute that line of code, which adds a dataset property called test. And let's go back to elements. And sure enough, look, on H1 there's now a data-test property which equals demo. In other words, I've altered the DOM. So if you want to attach a data property, this is a new HTML5 thing, you can say data hyphen and anything you like, then to store some information. And the way you access that data hyphen test property is, or one way is you can say data set dot and a value. And by the way, you should always kind of use lowercase there for reasons I'm not going to bother going into, but you'll find there's a difference between the case of something if you set it in the HTML and if you assign it via JavaScript, so it's just best to keep to lowercase. You can actually also use set attribute, but okay, I'm starting to ramble. I hope that's useful. Thank you very much. Over and out.